60,000. That's roughly how many STEM-related visas and permits the United States cut, delayed, restricted, or made significantly harder to obtain across multiple categories over the past year. And somewhere in China, university administrators didn't panic. They smiled. Because while Washington was trying to solve a domestic political problem, Beijing may have received something far more valuable than another semiconductor factory, another state subsidy package, or another industrial plan. It received time and talent. The strange thing is that America spent decades building the world's most successful talent import machine. Not oil, not rare earths, not manufacturing, talent. For generations, the brightest engineering student in Bangalore, Shanghai, Seoul, Taipei, Lagos, or Warsaw usually dreamed of the same destination, America. The formula was simple: study hard, get accepted into a top university, stay, build, invent, repeat. Silicon Valley wasn't built only by American-born engineers. It was built by attracting ambitious people from everywhere and convincing them that their future belonged there. That system produced extraordinary results. More than half of America's billion-dollar startup founders have immigrant backgrounds. Many of the country's most important research labs, AI companies, chip firms, and biotech ventures were filled with people who first arrived as students. Yet something curious has been happening. The door isn't fully closed, but it doesn't feel fully open either. Longer processing times, greater uncertainty, political battles surrounding immigration, questions over work permits, questions over residency, questions over whether staying is worth the gamble. And here's the part that gets overlooked. The world's smartest students don't just compare countries, they compare risk. A 22-year-old engineering graduate isn't asking, which country is best? They're asking, where can I build a life without constantly wondering whether I'm allowed to stay? That distinction matters a lot, because talent flows like capital. It seeks opportunity, stability, and predictability. Remove one of those ingredients and the flow changes direction. Not overnight, then suddenly. The irony is almost impressive. Washington has spent years discussing how to slow China's technological rise. China, meanwhile, doesn't necessarily need every American company to fail. It doesn't even need every Chinese student to come home. It only needs a slightly larger share of the global talent pool than it had before. That's a much easier objective. And unlike sanctions, tariffs, or export controls, talent compounds. One engineer becomes a startup founder. One founder trains hundreds of employees. One laboratory creates an ecosystem. One ecosystem changes an industry. The effects can take 10 years to appear. Then they seem obvious in hindsight. Remember that idea, because we're going to come back to it. The debate is usually framed as economics versus immigration. I think that's the wrong frame entirely. This is really a competition between two systems trying to answer the same question. Where should the next generation of scientists, chip designers, AI researchers, aerospace engineers, and biotech founders build their future? And for decades, America barely had to compete. The answer was assumed. Today, it isn't. That doesn't mean China has already won. Far from it. American universities remain unmatched in many fields. American venture capital remains enormously powerful. American research institutions still attract talent from every continent. But dominance and permanence are not the same thing. History is filled with countries that confuse the two. What makes this story fascinating isn't that China is producing more graduates. Most people already know that. What matters is what happened after graduation, because buried inside enrollment statistics, research hiring patterns, startup formation data, and university recruitment programs is evidence that something larger may be unfolding, something neither side fully anticipated. And it begins with a decision made by a student thousands of miles away who simply asks, should I stay here or go home? A few years ago, if you wanted to understand the future of technology, you looked at where the money was going. Today, it may be more useful to look at where graduates are going, because talent migration often predicts industrial power long before production statistics do. Take semiconductor manufacturing. Everyone talks about factories. Fewer people talk about engineers. A cutting-edge chip facility can cost $20 billion. That's expensive. Finding thousands of highly trained specialists who know how to operate it is often harder. Machines can be purchased. Expertise usually can't. This is one reason China spent years expanding engineering education at a scale that still surprises many Western observers. Universities such as Tsinghua University, Peking University, and dozens of less famous institutions were producing enormous numbers of STEM graduates, while local governments aggressively funded research parks, startup incubators, and technology zones. Critics often respond with a familiar argument: quantity is not quality. That's true. Producing 100 engineers does not automatically create 100 innovators. But the argument becomes weaker when the numbers become overwhelming. If a country graduates enough scientists, enough researchers, enough programmers, and enough engineers, eventually some percentage of them become exceptional. Scale starts generating its own advantages. That's what Beijing appears to understand. And this is where the VISAS story becomes more important than it first appears. Imagine you're a talented AI researcher finishing graduate school. 10 years ago, staying in America probably felt like the obvious choice. Today, the calculation is more complicated. Perhaps your visa status remains uncertain. Perhaps permanent residency could take years. Perhaps job sponsorship becomes unpredictable. Meanwhile, universities and technology firms back home are offering competitive salaries, research funding, housing support, startup incentives, and a clear path forward. The decision doesn't have to be ideological. It can be practical. People rarely move because of geopolitics. They move because they are planning a life. One underappreciated example emerged during the pandemic years. Many Chinese researchers who might have remained abroad returned home earlier than expected. Some joined universities, others joined semiconductor firms. Some entered China's rapidly expanding AI sector. The effect wasn't dramatic enough for headlines, but talent movements rarely are. A newspaper notices when a billion-dollar factory opens. It rarely notices when hundreds of highly skilled researchers quietly update their LinkedIn profiles. Years later, the consequences become visible. This is why I think many discussions about technological competition miss the mechanism entirely. Technology leadership isn't a scoreboard. It's a pipeline. Students become researchers. Researchers become founders. Founders create companies. Companies create industries. Industries create national advantages. Break any link in that chain and future growth weakens. Strengthen it and the effects compound. There's also a historical lesson hiding here. After World War II, the United States benefited enormously from attracting foreign scientists, engineers, and academics. Some fled conflict. Others simply followed opportunity. America didn't become a scientific superpower by keeping talent out. It became one by attracting talent in. That distinction matters because we're watching a new version of that competition emerge. Except this time, multiple countries are bidding for the same people. Canada expanded skilled immigration pathways. Singapore increased recruitment efforts. Several European countries simplified programs for high-skilled workers. China expanded incentives for overseas researchers and entrepreneurs. The competition is becoming global. And the funny part is that many governments still behave as if talent has nowhere else to go. It does. Highly skilled workers are remarkably mobile. Give them options and they'll use them. Still, before concluding that America is somehow losing this race, there's a complication we need to address. A major one. Because the numbers suggest one story. The innovation ecosystem suggests another. And when you put those two realities side by side, the picture becomes much harder to interpret. That's where this story gets interesting. Because the country producing more STEM graduates isn't necessarily the country producing more breakthroughs. At least not yet. The easy version of this story says America restricts visas, China gains talent, and the balance shifts. Reality is messier, and honestly, more interesting. Because if graduate numbers alone determine technological leadership, China would already be dominating every frontier industry on Earth. It isn't. At least not across the board. This is the reversal that complicates the entire argument. America still possesses something extraordinarily difficult to replicate. Not universities, not money, not even technology. Culture. Specifically, a culture that tolerates failure better than almost anyone else. That sounds soft compared to semiconductor fabs and AI models. It isn't. A 25-year-old engineer in Silicon Valley can quit a stable job, launch a startup, fail spectacularly, and still receive funding for the next attempt. Investors often view failure as experience. Many other systems view it as evidence you should stop trying. That difference matters. Because innovation is fundamentally inefficient. You don't get 10 breakthroughs from 10 attempts. You get 1 breakthrough from 100 attempts. Most fail, a few succeed. 1 changes an industry. The United States built institutions around this reality. Venture capital, university research partnerships, startup accelerators, deep financial markets, legal protections, networks that connect researchers, founders, investors, and customers. These aren't individual advantages, they're interconnected advantages. And that's precisely why predicting a technological winner is harder than counting graduates. Remember the student we talked about earlier? The one deciding whether to stay or return home? That decision isn't simply about salary, it's about ecosystems. An AI researcher might earn a competitive income in Beijing, Shenzhen, Shanghai, Boston, or San Francisco. But where can they find the strongest collaborators? Where can they raise funding? Where can they scale an idea into a global company? Those questions are harder to answer. And this is where both sides have strengths. China has become remarkably effective at scaling technologies once priorities are established. Electric vehicles are an obvious example. Companies such as BYD transformed from niche players into global competitors with surprising speed. Battery manufacturing followed a similar pattern. Industrial policy, financing, supply chains, and engineering talent reinforced each other. The result was difficult to ignore. America, meanwhile, remains exceptionally strong at generating entirely new categories. Artificial intelligence offers a recent example. Many foundational breakthroughs, major research papers, advanced computing frameworks, and leading AI companies still emerge from American institutions and firms. That advantage remains substantial. But here's the question I keep coming back to. What happens when talent begins dispersing more evenly? Not leaving America entirely, just spreading out. Imagine that instead of attracting the overwhelming majority of elite international STEM talent, the United States attracts merely a large share. The difference sounds minor. It isn't. Small shifts compound over decades. A baseball team doesn't collapse because one star player leaves. It declines when a few % of its talent disappears every season for years. By the time everyone notices, the standings already changed. This is why the visa debate carries consequences beyond immigration politics. The real issue isn't today's workforce, it's tomorrow's. A doctoral student entering university this year could be leading a major AI lab in 2040. A graduate currently choosing between California and Shanghai might eventually employ thousands of engineers. Future industries are being shaped by decisions that look ordinary right now. And there's another layer that receives surprisingly little attention: national security. Advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology. These aren't nearly commercial sectors anymore. Governments increasingly view them as strategic capabilities. That changes how talent is valued. Engineers are no longer just employees, they're becoming national assets. A strange phrase, but an increasingly accurate one. Which brings us back to that number from the beginning, 60,000. Whether the exact figure grows or shrinks matters less than the broader signal being sent, because signals influence expectations, expectations influence decisions, and decisions influence where innovation ecosystems develop over the next 20 years. The real question isn't whether America remains a technological leader. I think it will. The more difficult question is whether it remains as dominant as it once was. Those are very different standards, and the answer may depend less on factories, subsidies, and sanctions than on something surprisingly human. Whether ambitious people still believe their future belongs there. Let's go back to the beginning. 60,000. Not because the number itself determines the future, because of what it represents, a signal. And history is full of examples where signals mattered more than policies. Scientists don't move because of a single visa rule. Entrepreneurs don't relocate because of one election. Researchers don't abandon careers because of one government announcement. What changes behavior is accumulated uncertainty. 1,000 small doubts eventually become a decision. And once enough talented people start making similar decisions, entire industries begin drifting in new directions. That's why I think the most important question isn't whether China benefits from tighter American visa policies. Of course it does, at least to some extent. The more important question is whether the United States fully appreciates what made it exceptional in the first place. For decades, America's greatest competitive advantage wasn't manufacturing scale. It wasn't lower costs. It wasn't even superior government planning. Its advantage was that ambitious people from every continent believed they could arrive with almost nothing and build something extraordinary. That belief became an economic asset, a strategic asset, perhaps the most valuable asset of all. And unlike factories, you can't simply subsidize it into existence. Trust takes decades to build. It can weaken much faster. China understands this. The evidence is visible in program after program designed to attract overseas researchers, entrepreneurs, and technical specialists. Municipal governments compete for talent. Universities compete for talent. Technology firms compete for talent. The message is remarkably simple. If you come here, we'll help you build. Whether every promise succeeds is a different question, but the effort itself reveals how Beijing views the competition. Not as a contest for products, a contest for people. That's the angle many discussions miss. Countries don't invent technologies, people do. Countries create environments that either attract those people or push them elsewhere. Everything else follows from that. There's also a counter-argument worth taking seriously. Some will say America remains too far ahead for any of this to matter. Its universities are stronger. Its capital markets are deeper. Its companies remain dominant. Its research ecosystem is still the envy of much of the world. I think there's truth in that, a lot of truth. Predictions of American decline have a long history of embarrassing the people who make them. The United States has repeatedly adapted when competitors seemed ready to overtake it. Japan in the 1980 seconds, various economic scares in the 1990 seconds, China's manufacturing rise in the 2000 seconds. American resilience is real. Ignoring that would be a mistake. But assuming resilience means immunity would also be a mistake. The strongest institutions are usually damaged gradually, not suddenly. One policy here, one missed opportunity there, one generation of talent making slightly different choices. Nothing dramatic. Until one day, the landscape looks different than it did 20 years earlier. Think about the smartphone industry. Think about batteries. Think about solar panels. Entire sectors can shift while political debates remain focused somewhere else. My own view is fairly straightforward. I don't think China is about to replace America as the world's innovation center, not in the near future. What I do think is that we're entering an era where technological leadership becomes more distributed, more competitive, less automatic. The days when elite global talent overwhelmingly chose one destination may be fading. And if that trend continues, the consequences won't appear first in headlines. They'll appear in laboratories, then startups, then patents, then industries. By the time politicians notice, the decisions that shape the outcome will have been made years earlier. Remember that student we started with? The one asking whether to stay or go home? Multiply that decision by thousands, then tens of thousands, then generations. That's where the real story lives. Not in visa paperwork, not in political speeches, not even in university rankings. The future is being shaped by where highly skilled people decide to spend the next 30 years of their lives. My prediction? The countries that win the next technological era won't necessarily be the richest or the largest. They'll be the places that make talented people feel welcome, useful, and confident enough to build. Everything else is secondary. And if Beijing is sending thank you cards, they're probably not thanking America for losing talent today. They're thanking it for making some of tomorrow's talent think twice. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and come back for the next one. The biggest geopolitical stories are often hiding inside decisions that look boring at first glance. Sometimes the future of technology begins with a student filling out a form.